I work at a cemetery on the edge of my town. It's a small one, being only a few acres of land. I'd been working there for a year at the time, and I hated every minute of it. Not really because it was a cemetery, but just because it was boring. I was alone all night and sat in a small room for most of the time. There were 2 cameras set up on either side of the yard and one on the entrance of the tiny building I was in. My boss always told me that my job was to just be there, and if anything actually happens, then to call the police and let them take care of it. In the whole year before this, not a single thing happened. Again, it was a small cemetery in a small town, so not a lot of action was expected. On a Monday evening, I pulled into the parking lot and relieved my coworker from his day shift. I hadn't slept the best that day, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me up. For the first hour, I was sipping on my coffee and watching the cameras while also scrolling through my phone a bit. Come 1 a.m., I started to get really drowsy. I was nodding off in my chair, and the coffee wasn't really helping either. In the middle of the hour, I guess I fully fell asleep. What I think was 20 or so minutes later, I woke up to an odd sound, metal creaking behind me. I swiveled around in my chair. The door to my building was cracked open, swaying slightly from the wind outside. My heart hurt from the strike of fear it gave me. I got up and pulled the door further open, peeking my head outside and looking around. Nobody was in sight. I slammed the door firmly shut and made sure it was fully locked. It could have been a simple mistake, not fully closing the door, but it got my hair standing up. I rolled back the footage outside the building and didn't see anyone coming up to the building. At least after this, I was wide awake. I was constantly checking each camera. About 10 minutes later, I saw something move on the screen. It was the camera on the far end of the yard. Someone was walking through the cemetery. I watched as they slowly made their way past several gravestones, then stopped. I waited a few seconds before picking up the phone and dialing 911, still keeping my eyes on the screen. I spoke softly into the phone, telling the operator that I worked at the cemetery and there was a man trespassing. The woman on the phone started responding when suddenly the man sprinted through the yard and off of the screen. I let out an uncontrollable gasp, moving my eyes all around the other cameras looking for him. A second later, he appeared on the other screen, sprinting past it again, and not long after, he appeared on the screen showing the outside of the building I was in. I told the woman what was going on, that I needed to be quiet. I put the phone down and stared at the camera. It was a man who was now standing right outside the door. Then he looked around at the face of the building before locking his eyes on the camera. It made me shiver, seeing him stare at the camera as if he could see me through the screen. "Hello? Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice from the other side of the door. Then, without even waiting for an answer, he walked around to the back of the building. There were no cameras on that side, but I could hear his footsteps in the grass. He sounded like he was walking right up against the wall. Then out of nowhere, I heard his footsteps departing quickly. My heart was racing all the way up until the police came. I thought I'd sound crazy, but they found very defined shoe prints in the grass. They followed them far off, way past the cemetery border, but lost the trail before it led anywhere else. The man's behavior was very odd, and the way he asked for help was even odder. I don't know if the door being opened earlier was somehow him, but I don't know what to believe anymore. Despite being scared shitless, I continued working and still work there. Nothing else has happened, and the man never returned, but I don't think I'll ever fall asleep at the cemetery again. In my mid-30s, about 10 years ago, I worked as security personnel at a cemetery. It was located in a not-so-great part of the city, so having someone on site 24/7 was necessary. Even then, we'd still get people sneaking in and spraying graffiti on the stones or even trying to dig up graves. Most of these stunts happened at night, which was good for me because I always worked the evening shift, usually from 2 to 10. Granted, I'd still have to be there alone for a couple of hours into the night, between 8 and 10, but it was still much better than the alternative graveyard shift. On this day, I was warned about some people coming by the cemetery at random hours and just sort of stalking the place. It had been going on for a few days, and the other workers weren't sure who they were or what they were doing. I said I'd keep an eye out. By 6 o'clock, the other workers had left, and it was just me. This was always my favorite half of my shift because I wouldn't have to worry about looking like I was busy the whole time. If we're being real, there wasn't ever much point to me being there when the other workers were around too anyway. If you don't already know, the job is made up mostly of riding around in a golf cart and making sure nothing is going on. From 6 to 8, I drove around and picked up a few pieces of trash left in the yard. There were a few more visitors that came, and at 8:30, I waited for the last people to leave. Then I went to lock up the front gate. While wrapping the chain around the bars and putting the lock on, I noticed a group of people on the other side of the road. They were facing my direction like they were watching me. I finished securing the gate, then got back in my cart and drove off. I knew that it was likely the group I was told to keep an eye out for, so I parked the cart in a spot where I could still see them. There were 3 people from what I could see. They stayed in the same spot for a couple of minutes before walking away. I drove around, making sure they weren't trying to find a way in on the sides, but I didn't see them. Around 9 o'clock, I parked by the front gate again for a few minutes when I heard a sharp sound echo through the field. I whipped my head around in the direction it came from, but it was too dark to see. I started the cart back up and made my way through the field. The sound was so echoey and loud that I couldn't tell if it was from inside the cemetery or from just outside of it. As I drove through, I started to see some figures in the distance, only 2 figures though, not the 3 I'd seen earlier. As I pulled closer, they noticed me, turning their bodies to face me but not running. I stopped the cart maybe 15 feet away and got out. The place closes at 8:30. "You gotta go," I called out. I took a few steps forward. "Do I really have to call the cops?" I said, getting more irritated and slightly more nervous. That's when I noticed one of them was holding something. It was a shovel, but they weren't really standing close to any gravestones. I looked down at the ground next to them, and there was a clear spot they'd been digging in. Then out of nowhere, I heard a guy behind me yell. The 2 started running, and the one behind me ran in a different direction. I got in the cart and turned it on to try and chase the one guy, but right away, I could feel that something was wrong with the cart. It was shaking and wobbling when I tried to drive it. I got out, and it was clear that the 2 left tires had been slashed. I frantically called the police and ran to the main building. Thankfully, the group didn't seem interested in chasing me, but seeing as they had likely slashed the tires with a knife and that there were 3 of them, I was terrified. When the police arrived, the group was long gone, but we did find the half-dug-out hole they made. We were really confused by it until we found something else along the fence not far from the hole they were digging. We found a body bag. Yes, unfortunately, there was a body in it. After some days went by, it came out that the man in the bag was part of some gang and must have been killed in a shooting. What we think is that the group was trying to dispose of the body discreetly and thought that if they dug a grave and buried him in a cemetery, then it would blend in and nobody would find it. I can't say it was a terrible plan, but the execution of it wasn't the best. Although none of the men in the group were ever found or identified. I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots. A 30-something-year-old man named Claude, a very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Claude was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. Unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Claude arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Claude in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop where I would stand with my umbrella, supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night. So, a little later, I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker, but on this stormy day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge they turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually, I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm, and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slammed shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello." My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello." Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when, through one of them, I saw someone on the other side looking back at me with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic, older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Claude's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields, he wasn't hiding in a bush nearby, he was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate once more, locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her it was a long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. When I was 18, my friend Dash, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand, and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstones were very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries and had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a Gothic metal fence and surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Dash managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, reddish kind of day, conveniently adding to the mood. Dash pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low-traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Dash kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliché, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Dash how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass. But they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Dash we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him, "Don't." I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around a building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. Not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. Just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Dash. Dash was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone. So I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Dash was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. I've never told this story to anyone. I know I shouldn't even do so anonymously at the risk of being connected to it, but it's been eating at me for decades. It happened when I was a kid. I was about 13 years old, and it was the night of Halloween. I lived in a relatively new suburb at the time, which had been built to increase the number of homes in the small town that was growing adjacent to the freeway. It all looks very different now, but back then the area wasn't nearly as developed. Strangely, nowhere was this more obvious than the cemetery that was a few turns off the main road in what used to be the outskirts. At the time, it was mostly vacant. Not enough people had died to fill it up yet. That would change, however, as me and my two friends, who I'll protect by calling Aaron and Michael, decided we wanted to go exploring the empty graveyard instead of trick-or-treating. We knew it would get us in trouble, so we put in some effort to cover our tracks. We wore costumes and started the night by immediately stealing a few bowls of candy that were set out and mixed them all together so it would look as though we actually went trick-or-treating like our parents thought. Then we walked about a mile off the beaten path so we could get to the cemetery without being seen by the cars on the main road. This involved hopping a fence that surrounded a large drainage pond for the freeway and cutting across the banks to hop the fence again into the cemetery grounds. As we got off the residential streets, we were bathed in darkness, which meant there was almost no chance that we would be seen. We thought we were safe, but what we didn't know was that we were being followed. Once we had successfully snuck in, we stomped around and tried to scare each other for laughs. Then we found a few blank gravestones laying around next to a crypt, and we smashed them together just because we could. We took a few chunks as souvenirs. There wasn't much else for us to get up to, though. The whole place was eerily empty. We were used to seeing them filled to the brim with gravestones, but the majority of this space was just uninterrupted grass. Eventually, we got bored, but we weren't ready to leave, so we sat down against the backs of a few gravestones to avoid sitting on top of dead people. There was a view of the freeway that looked pretty cool since it was the only thing that was lit up for miles. For a moment, we were just sitting there being kids. Then it all came crashing down as we heard what sounded like a person behind us. We all jumped in fright and we turned around. We couldn't see anything, just gravestones. The ghastly wailing continued, and then it started to say our names. We shouted at it, trying to claim we weren't scared of it, but we were. We thought we were totally alone, so maybe it was a ghost that was mad at us for being there when we weren't supposed to be. We started walking towards it with small, terrified steps, hoping we would look behind one of the gravestones and see a person messing with us. All three of us were clutching broken chunks of granite as if it would help defend us from the supernatural. When we started getting closer, it seemed like we were localizing the source of the noise. That's when it said something that I wished it wouldn't every single day. For context, my friend Aaron's mother was extremely ill with cancer at the time. That's part of the reason that we were acting out by breaking into the cemetery in the first place. He was in a funk, and he was mad at the world, and he was our friend that we did stuff with. Understandably, Aaron stopped in his tracks when the voice claimed that it was the ghost of his mother. I can't imagine what was going on through his head, a lot of powerful mixed emotions that must have been a lot for a 13-year-old to handle. He shouted back, trying to cast it out, but he was already choking up. The supposed ghost of his mother dug deeper, saying that she just died a few minutes ago. Aaron said that was a lie, but the voice didn't care. It started to cry and say that because he wasn't in the neighborhood like a good boy, his father wasn't able to find him, and she died wondering where her son was and why he didn't love her enough to be there. Aaron yelled again that it wasn't true, that it couldn't be, but it struck him so badly he was failing to hold back his tears. Michael and I started trying our best to console him, not really knowing how. But then the mood changed on a dime when the unknown voice stopped crying and started laughing. Then it didn't sound like the ghost of a woman anymore, but a snickering boy. We looked over and saw someone crawling out of their hiding spot behind a gravestone. It was somebody we knew, but I can't say his name. He was a couple of years older than us, and he was a neighborhood bully. He must have seen us sneaking off and followed us so he could pull some kind of prank like this for kicks. All of Aaron's sadness turned into anger in an instant as he charged toward the bully, who was laughing so hard he didn't notice how pissed off Aaron was. Nobody expected him to do what he did next. Aaron tackled the boy to the ground and started beating on him, screaming furiously that it was way too far to joke about someone's sick mother dying. Michael and I agreed, and we hated being bullied by this kid too, so we let it happen, figuring it would teach the jerk a lesson. Unfortunately, we didn't notice before it was too late that Aaron wasn't just pounding the kid in the face with his fists, but with the chunk of gravestone he'd broken off a few minutes prior. After just a few more seconds, there was no sound or movement from the bully, no indication at all that he was still fighting back. Michael and I exchanged a worried look right before deciding that this, in fact, was going too far and we needed to stop it. We rushed over to Aaron and pulled him off the bully. As we held him back, we looked down at the other kid and saw just how badly he'd been beaten. The jagged stone had turned his face into an unrecognizable bloody mess. There were deep gashes all over his face and head. Even in the darkness, we knew. But we still waited for him to get up or to at least groan in pain. But he never did. Gradually, Aaron let go of his rage and he came to realize what he'd done. Michael and I were already stunned. He broke away from us, but then he rushed back into panic, trying to wake the kid up by shaking and yelling his name. But none of it was any good. He finally looked back at us and he asked us to say that he was just unconscious and not dead. Only one of us knew how to check. I could see that Michael was shaking as he stepped to the body and knelt down, checking for a pulse. He checked and waited, even bringing his ear down to his face to check for breathing. But unfortunately, he only confirmed the worst. Aaron had killed our neighborhood bully. After an internal silence, Aaron snapped us out of our daze. He took charge of the moment. He led us through the cover-up. We all thought about just coming clean, but we were so afraid of the repercussions. Well, Aaron was, and there was a small sick part of us that was glad that it happened, to be honest. The bully got what he deserved, to a certain extent. We did our best to think so anyways. Besides, we had no idea how to act in a situation like that, so we just listened to the orders that we heard. We dragged the body to the fence around the drainage pond and ripped the bottom of the chain link fence out of the dirt so we could pull the body under to the other side. Then we got a gravestone and a bunch of broken chunks and threw them over, including the ones we thought were going to be souvenirs for the night. We took off his shoes and his jeans, then slid a gravestone underneath his shirt, fastening it to his chest by tying his jeans around his torso. Then we tied his shoes to his ankles and filled them with stones. Aaron then dragged the body into the pond, and he was holding it up until he was neck deep. Then he pushed it towards the center and let go. We watched it sink as Aaron turned around and came out of the water looking like a completely different person. Aaron's clothes needed to dry at least a little bit so we didn't look obviously drenched before we went back to the neighborhood, and we needed to make sure that the body wouldn't immediately float to the surface. So after throwing everything related to the killing in the pond and washing our hands of the blood, we hopped the fence and sat on the banks for a while where we couldn't be seen. It was totally silent the entire time. The bloodstains had been rinsed out of his clothes, but we would never be able to look at Aaron without seeing them. It was on our hands now too, and we had to live with that. It was hard to pretend to be a normal kid after that twisted coming-of-age moment. The disappearance was the talk of the town for days, even weeks, until the body finally floated to the surface a few weeks later and the murder was discovered. Nobody ever suspected us, but the publicity of the case going unsolved was torturous for us all, and the worst for Aaron. Michael and I were able to get back to a semblance of normal after a couple of years, but Aaron was never the same. When his mother finally died, he never talked to us again, and he never made any other friends. He kind of became the town degenerate, and nobody but Michael and I knew the real reason why. When he was 17, he ran away from home, and he's never been seen or heard from since.